some of the books that I will discuss, some of the philosophers that I'll discuss. You know, if I'll kind of just start this out saying that most people nowadays, and I think it's even trending on YouTube to some extent, like Nietzsche, and you've heard of Machiavelli, right? Maybe you've heard of some of these names. You've heard of maybe Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. You might have heard of Schopenhauer and these kinds of names, even, right? You might have heard of even those types of very esoteric names. The problem is that there are a lot of great philosophers that really go not necessarily unrecognized, but not recognized enough, I think. There are a lot of these thinkers that I think get their appeal, probably Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, because they were subversive. They're really subversive. And so people get drawn to them and they become trendy for a while, which I'm not saying that they aren't worthwhile philosophers to look at and to consider. But things like Stoicism and these that kind of things, they get drawn into the popular discussion for a while. They become really really trendy, but then at the same time, a lot of these other philosophers get forgotten, right? Oh, yeah. Thank you, Herman. Yeah, maybe I'll be someone a great philosopher that people look up to. I'm not sure. What I want to do is I want to be able to contribute my own knowledge to the discussion. Yeah. Hey, welcome, Black Air Force Energy. So there are a lot of these trendy philosophers or philosophers that become trendy. But then these little known ones I'm going to talk about. There are three of them. Obviously, if you already read the description, I'm going to talk about Alan Gewirth, who you probably have never heard of in your life, right? Who's that? Right? I'll talk about him. Incredibly influential, by the way. But when do you hear his name? Jurgen Habermas, which, no, I am not from Switzerland. I'm actually from the U.S., but if you're from Switzerland, that's cool, right? I probably should visit Switzerland. I love to visit new places, so soon, probably soon. And Herman, you said you're from Austria, I think, right? Austria? Or was it Germany? I think you said Austria at one point, so I have to go visit Austria. But the idea is, yeah, Jürgen Habermas, though, is a little bit more well known. Okay, yeah, awesome. And Mozart, where Mozart was born, right? So I think about Mozart immediately when I think about Austria, but yeah. So there's much more interesting stuff about Austria, though, historically. Amazing history, Austria, right? But anyway, Jürgen Habermas was a German philosopher, and he is fairly well known. But you hear so much about, have you ever heard of the philosopher Foucault, maybe, or Horkheimer, Adorno? Like, they talk about all these guys, but then where's Jürgen Habermas in a lot of the discussion? I'll talk about why he's really important, right? And then the last one is somebody, again, most people have never heard of, but he has been incredibly influential. R.M. Hare. The last name is Hare. Hare. R.M. Hare. All right, so why are these three? Why do I think these three? And I chose only three. There are more, but why did I choose these three? Because they have had really important discussions about value theory. And of course, if you guys have watched my channel for a while, you know that my background's in value theory, academically, published in value theory and all that stuff. But what I believe is at the heart of a lot of disagreements and conversations, and a lot of important discussions, is value, right? Why do people disagree upon a lot of things? Value, right? Values, differences of values, many times. And so we'll talk about why they're important. But you said, what are the three books? So I actually, let me put my coffee down. So this is one of Alan Gewirth's books. It's called The Community of Rights. Now, this is more of like his political philosophy, but so you can see the title. But I actually don't own a copy of back when I was doing a lot of this research. I I was working out of university libraries. Like that, university libraries have endless of these books, right? And if it doesn't have the book, you can request the book and all of that stuff. But his original book here, his most important book about ethics, about ethical theory, about value theory, is called Reason and Morality. Reason and Morality. Very, very simple title. So you can look that up. Really, really influential book. And then this is one of Jurgen Habermas's most influential books. It's the Philosophical Discourse of Modernity. It's actually a lot about, after World War II, Jurgen Habermas talked about why did the things that happened in Germany, or why did things that happened in Nazi Germany, why did that happen, right? He and of course the other, what are called the Frankfurt School of Philosophers, Horkheimer, Adorno, they fled Germany during the time, and they actually stayed at Columbia University, all right, and then they went back to Germany afterwards, and they said, why did that happen, right? This is a little bit of an analysis of Jurgen Habermas's understanding of that and the philosophical implications of it. But Jurgen Habermas's most famous work is about ethics and about value theory is not in this book. You can actually the title is escaping me at the moment. I don't know why the title is escaping me at the moment, but his I'm gonna remember it later. Oh yeah, here it is. It's called The Theory of Communicative Action. Okay, again, the theory of communicative action. He and another philosopher named Karl Otto Appel kind of corresponded. Otto Appel disagreed with some of the foundations of what Habermas talked about, but they both agreed on some important points. So, welcome, Shivansh. Hey, how you doing? I hope you're doing well. So, let's get into why they're important one at a time. And Hare's books, again, I don't own any copies of Hare's books. I always took them out of the libraries and always hey, well, you randomly dropped on my channel, so welcome. So again, when I was doing a lot of this research, I only had access to the library books. So, but I have all the notes I've ever taken. I still have all the notes I've ever taken. So, let's actually start with R.M. Hare. So they all talk about, they're all addressing the objectivity of value, right? And I think the objectivity of value is an important discussion, especially talking about R.M. Hare. All of these were post-World War II philosophers, coming out of World War II, coming out of seeing a lot of the atrocities, a lot of the lead up to World War II. Why did everything happen the way it did? And what are the moral implications? And many philosophers, like the existentialists in Europe, what are called the existentialists, they took the one route and postmodernists, they took one route and said, everything is, I'm oversimplifying, but everything is subjective, truth is subjective, almost like a sense of hopelessness in that philosophy, but in a sense, a renewed hope, a renewed sense of individuality. That's one path. These other philosophers, they took another path. I wouldn't say Jurgen Habermas is in the an analytic philosopher, but there was a school of thought called analytic philosophy. R.M. Hare and Alan Gewirth belong to that school of analytic philosophy. So there are two philosophers in Europe and the United States that kind of split off and went different directions in reaction to their experiences of World War II. Do I know about Osho? You'll have to give me a full name. I not off the top of my head, but feel free to share. Always love to learn about new philosophers and new thinkers. But okay, R.M. Hare said there has to be, just like for morality, just like language follows certain rules. All right, all systems kind of follow certain rules, and so language of morality must also follow some rules, right? some analytic philosophers said, like Charles Stevenson, for instance, notably, said all ethical language, all moral language is just emotional language. It's just emotion, right? It's a position called emotivism. There are actually some problems with that position, a lot of problems. And I'm not going to go into the problems with that position, with emotivism, today. But Hare said, it's emotivism isn't really an adequate theory. Just that morality is just their emotional statements. Let's get behind this and really understand what's going on when we make moral statements. And what he was one of the first, one of the pioneers in this tradition to say, let's analyze moral language and try to understand what we're saying. So he looked at the logic of language itself, moral language itself. And he developed a moral theory. And he actually was British. He fought in World War II. And he said, if we take a look at just some intuitions about morality, and you take the kind of the golden rule. If you think of the golden rule, you should treat others how you would want to be treated, and all of that stuff. This philosophy kind of elaborates on this, kind of gives that more of a logical foundation, but it's a little bit more sophisticated because there are problems with the golden rule. The golden rule, treat others how you would want to be treated. Well, what's the problem there? What's the problem there is other people might not want to be treated the same way you want to be treated. So you have to adjust for that. Some people now call this the platinum rule, right? Treat others the way they would want to be treated. And this is a little bit more in line with Hare's philosophy. But anyway, I don't want to lay out all the logic here because it's just a live stream today. But if you ever have a longer discussion with me, we will. Genius 1000, hey, welcome to the live stream. So yeah, I'll move on now. R.M. Hare is a really great philosopher. So for many reasons, I think R.M. Hare has a lot of problems in his philosophy. Although in my writings on this topic, I do critique R.M. Hare. However, I do show that one thing that we can derive from his theory is that is what I call a negative form of justification. What I think is that we can't, from Hare's work, we can't develop some position or some idea definitively of what is right and what is wrong. However, with his one thing that his theory did really well, I believe, is that it showed us what types of statements cannot be used as justifications. And no matter your position on morality, whatever, it is a very powerful thing to be able to say, well, there are certain reasons logically that you cannot give for an action that you want to take, right? And again, a lot of this was motivated by what he saw in World War II, right? Almost like a need, like I have to understand, I have to reconcile with what I witnessed, right? And so it bothered him, and just like it bothered me, I really wanted to publish on this, and back in 2013. So I did. I was driven to kind of solve this problem. So Hare, I think, did solve a very important problem, which is finding judgments that cannot be valid for making moral conclusions. That's really important. That's a very important foundation. Why is it so important? One, it does disprove a lot of theories. It does disprove, for instance, taking that position disproves things like subjectivism, subjective morality, or nihilism. Now, I do want to say something about subjective morality because we'll talk about Jurgen Habermas. One of the arguments on behalf of a lot of the Frankfurt School and things like that, they said, well, if you're too rational about morality, you could be too rational about morality. And in trying to be so rational about morality, you become moralistic. What do I mean by moralistic? They saw that problem in Nazi Germany. You must follow this way, and only this way, and unquestionably so. And that's what a lot of people hear, I think, when they hear that morality is not subjective, it's objective, right? It can be objective. They hear some sort of oppression in that, right? But the interesting thing about it is that if what is oppression? Oppression is a moral concept, right? If you don't accept that at some level there's some objectivity, there are some moral statements that logically cannot follow, right? Then you can't argue against oppression at all because it's just up to your opinion or my opinion, right? So you do need some objective morality even to argue against this idea of people being oppressed. So, and that it's a bad thing, right? Otherwise, no, it's not a bad thing. You go back to Nietzsche, which, again, if Nietzsche's correct, Nietzsche's correct. Right? We should accept the truth and want to accept the truth no matter what the truth is, right? That's what being a great thinker is about. It's about pursuing truth, pursuing knowledge, regardless of where that leads you. Even if, and that's a scary thing. I think philosophy can be a very scary thing because it takes having a commitment to truth. And truth above all, because, and again, it is really scary psychologically because what if you don't like the answer, right? What if you don't like the answer? It's very possible that when you pursue truth, you don't like the answer. It bothers you. It might keep you up at night if you know the truth. But you know, I think it's worth it. I think it's very much worth it. It's worth it to pursue the truth, even if that does psychologically bother us. It takes courage, it takes bravery. But so if Nietzsche is correct, he's correct. I just don't think he's correct with respect to objective morality. In fact, let's talk about Nietzsche for a moment. Actually, that'll be too long of a live stream if I get onto a tangent about Nietzsche. But maybe another live stream we could talk about Nietzsche. Yeah, Nietzsche. Okay, Genius 1000. I'll talk about Nietzsche for a moment. Just my broad assessment. I disagree with Nietzsche in terms of most of his actual claims. However, let's differentiate that between the spirit of his claims. I actually agree with him in much of the spirit of his claims. What does that mean? In terms of if you evaluate the actual claim itself, I believe many of them are false, right? But if you evaluate the spirit of his claims, meaning how did he, Plato talks about the tripartite soul and stuff like that. So, with the spirit of his claim, well, he is this kind of anti-authoritarian, right? He's anti-authority. He doesn't want to just accept something because somebody told him. He doesn't want to just right. So I admire that spirit, right? That individual expression, right? And that's what he's all about. However, interestingly, in his philosophy, he starts to be the one to tell people he's all about against moralism, right? But then in his ideas against being moralistic, he starts to himself sound moralistic, if that makes sense. So yeah, right. He stood up for what he believes in. But yeah, so I'm in agreement with the spirit of his work, but when it comes down to the actual truth claims and stuff like that, I don't think it works. But there's more to the value of a philosophy than just the truth or falsehood of the actual philosophy. We can examine and admire the spirit of a philosophy, even if we don't agree with maybe even much of the content, right? So Jurgen Habermas called morality intersubjective. He said it's intersubjective. He made a very interesting point, which I think holds, that we cannot really know what is moral, or what actually his claim was even more subjective than that. Morality itself cannot be decided by an individual. Morality itself cannot be found by an individual, and this is what he claimed. because our environment, our moral reality, and he uses a lot of the research from Lawrence Kohlberg, the psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg, Stages of Moral Development, and he says that morality cannot even be understood from a purely individual standpoint. We need other people. We need discussion among other people to really decide what is moral, right? I think that's actually an important position to take. So, good morning, Nikhil. Bonjour. And Black Air Force Energy. What book is it? So, here you go. Here's the title. Jurgen Habermas. So, it's the Philosophical Discourse of Modernity. But his book on ethics, which is much less known, is what is it? The theory of communicative action. The theory of communicative action. And King Nadish, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. I try to offer you guys value whenever I can. So that is an important point from Jurgen Habermas. Well worth reading his work. Well worth. It is a little bit tough, but and then Alan Gewirth. Let's talk about him for a moment. So Alan Gewirth, he was an analytical philosopher. Jurgen Habermas was not what you'd consider an analytical philosopher, but analytical philosopher in the sense that Alan Gewirth took the idea of agency. He went back to words, talking about language. Well, King Nadish, this is great because if you read a lot of these things, I think it will get you out of your depression because these are very inspiring books, I would say. Camus, yes. If you read Camus, well, what I was just saying earlier, Camus is like, at the end of World War II, after World War II, the philosophical world took two paths broadly, in the Western world at least. Right? I don't want to overlook what happens in the Eastern world, but in the Western world, the philosophical traditions took two paths. One path was more like existentialism, postmodernism. That's kind of where Camus fits in. And it was a little bit more, you might say, depressive. And the other part was kind of like a renewal in the sense of a more analytical look at language, at philosophy from the standpoint of language. How do we use these words? What is a meaningful statement? What is a meaningful claim? Right? Let's start there before we even talk about truth and all of these lofty things. Let's start with how can we even evaluate these claims in the first place? So what's the Red Book? The Red Book is The Community of Rights by Alan Gewirth. Again, this is his political philosophy, but if you want to read his foundational work on value theory, on ethical theory, you would go to Reason and Morality. The book is Reason and Morality. Again, very good book. What he did was he built upon a lot of what R.M. Hare did, and he talked about, can we prove the existence of human rights? Right now, especially nowadays, there's a lot of rhetoric like, let's do some crazy things politically. Let's do some let's go back to whatever mercantilism, whatever, and let's go back to how we did things in medieval times. I mean, it's really some crazy stuff, right? So we have to understand it's a good time in these days to really understand, do human rights have any foundation at all? Do they have any foundation at all? Yeah. Well, Jurgen Habermas would say yes, because he said that morality is discursive. But Gewirth, and again, Alan Gewirth gets almost no respect. He gets almost no, like, I haven't ever heard pretty much anybody in the philosophical world talk about Gewirth. But Gewirth's work on human rights, and logically, in a very detailed way, logically deriving human rights, it's incredible. It's incredible stuff, and it has actually contributed a lot to philosophical thought, even though he's not mentioned a lot. It has contributed to a lot of value theorists' theories and things like that. So again, I believe you cannot do critical thinking. We talk about critical thinking on this channel, right? This is what it's all about. You can't really do critical thinking without understanding value theory, right? A lot of critical thinking, when people talk about critical thinking, they talk about, yeah, understanding a logical statement, understanding whatever, statistical methods and stuff like that. Yeah, that's all important. Exactly. It is important. But why do we disagree? Why do we often disagree? Why do we have these heated discussions? And why do we have these incredibly ill-informed opinions a lot of the times, but we're very insistent on those opinions? It all comes back to values. It comes back to values and value theory. We have to understand these deeply, at a deeper level. Once we do, we have a really good way of understanding ourselves, understanding other people. So these are some of the reads. Guys, if you want to do more intensive work on this, check out my Critical Thinking Academy, newly launched, going really well. It's in the more information in the link in my bio. But yeah, I love being with you guys every week, sharing some of the knowledge, sharing some of the books, sharing some ideas, hearing from you, your input, and feel free to reach out to me just to chat, right? I'm always open to have a conversation, start a conversation, whatever, hear your advice, give my advice, and it's all part of this amazing process. So I appreciate you guys. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you next week.